She was 19 years old, standing on a dead man's land, with a rifle she barely knew how to reload and seeds nobody wanted. The lawyers had laughed. The neighbors had shaken their heads. But Rowena Ashcroft was still standing, and whatever was growing in that soil was about to make every last one of them regret turning their backs on her. If you want to see how a girl nobody believed in built something that couldn't be taken away, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't you dare look away.
The
wagon wheel cracked on a rock hidden under the mud, and Rowena felt the whole left side of the rig lurch and drop before she could do anything about it. She pulled the mule to a hard stop, set the brake, and climbed down into the cold without saying a word. There wasn't anyone to say anything to. Hadn't been for 3 weeks now. She walked around to assess the damage. The wheel hadn't shattered, just the iron rim popped loose on one side, the wood bowing out with the weight of everything she owned stacked in the bed. Trunks, a cast iron Dutch oven, 2 wool blankets her mother had woven the winter before she died, a Winchester rifle in a scabbard of cracked leather, and the seed box. The seed box, her father had told her, was the only thing that mattered. She stood in the Wyoming wind for a long moment, hands on her hips, looking at the wagon, then at the ridge line ahead, then at the sky which had been threatening snow since she'd left Casper. October of 1891 was not a forgiving month to be traveling alone. "Come on then," she said mostly to herself. She found a flat rock, used it to lever the rim back into a rough approximation of where it belonged, wrapped it twice with the length of rawhide she'd been saving for exactly this kind of emergency, and climbed back onto the seat. The mule, she called him Juniper because he was stubborn and bitter, and somehow always managed to survive, moved forward without her even snapping the reins. He knew. The homestead was another 6 miles north and east of where she was. She'd only seen it once, last spring, when she and her father had ridden out to look at the claim before he'd gotten too sick to travel. He'd stood on the low ridge overlooking the creek draw and told her the land had good bones. "Bones," she'd said. "Daddy, there's nothing out here." "That's the point," he'd told her. Porter Ashcroft had been a quiet, methodical man who'd spent 20 years as an apothecary's assistant in Ohio before something broke in him after Rowena's mother passed. He'd sold the shop and moved them west. Not to mine, not to ranch, not to chase the cattleman's dream that everyone in the territory seemed to be chasing. He'd come out here because of plants. He'd spent the last 4 years of his life learning from every person willing to teach him. Shoshone women who knew the river valleys better than any surveyor, a German botanist passing through Cheyenne on his way to California, an old Chinese herbalist who'd stayed behind after the railroad work dried up. Porter Ashcroft had written down everything in a leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket like another man might keep a Bible, and he'd assembled slowly, carefully, a collection of seeds that Rowena didn't fully understand and that most people had never heard of. When he died in August, fever, fast and unsparing, the lawyers in town had reviewed the claim and told her to sell it. It wasn't worth working, they'd said. Not enough acreage for cattle, no timber to speak of. The creek ran intermittent. She'd do better to take what she could get from a buyer and find work in town, maybe at one of the boarding houses. "Or," said the younger lawyer, a man named Tilden who wore his collar too tight, "you could marry. That would solve the land question." Rowena had looked at him for long enough that he'd stopped talking. She kept the claim, paid the county fee herself with the last of what her father had left. And now here she was, bouncing along a rutted wagon track toward a piece of land that every single person who'd heard about it had told her wasn't worth the paper the deed was printed on. Boom. She arrived at the property in the gray hour before dusk. It was not impressive. A dugout cabin built into the south face of a low hill, 4 walls of sod and timber, a door that hung slightly crooked, a single window covered with oilskin that had gone brittle in the sun. The roof needed re-chinked. The iron stove inside, when she forced the door open and looked in, had a crack running up one side that she'd need to deal with before she lit a fire in it. The small barn behind the cabin, really more of a lean-to, had lost half its roof to a storm at some point, and nobody had bothered to fix it. She stood in the middle of it and let herself feel the weight of it, just for a minute. Let herself think about the lawyers and their suggestions and the look on Tilden's face when he'd said the word marry like it was the obvious answer to everything. She stood there in the cold, empty, half-broken room and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was somewhere in between. Then she went back outside and started unloading the wagon. But the first week was about survival in the most basic sense. She fixed the stove crack with clay from the creek bank, let it dry 2 days before she dared light a fire. Re-chinked the worst gaps in the sod walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass. Fixed the roof on the lean-to well enough to get juniper out of the wind. Found where the property's best water was. Not the creek, which ran thin this time of year, but a seep spring a 1/4 mile up the draw that pushed clear and cold year-round. She hauled water from it every morning in 2 tin buckets until her shoulders ached. There was a neighbor 3 miles south, a ranching family named Brennan. The wife, Clara, rode out in the second week with a covered dish of bean soup and a flat expression that wasn't unfriendly exactly, just reserved. She looked around the property with the careful eyes of someone who'd been in this country a long time. "You're Ashcroft's girl," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Your daddy was a peculiar man." Clara handed over the soup. "I mean that respectfully. He had unusual ideas." "He did? You planning to stay?" Rowena took the soup and met the older woman's eyes. "That's the plan." Clara looked at the patched lean-to, the re-chinked walls, the winter sky behind them. Whatever she was calculating, she kept it to herself. "My husband Dale says this land's no good for much. Too broken up, wrong drainage." "He might be right," Rowena said. "But you're staying." "Yes, ma'am." Clara nodded once, slowly, like she was filing the information away. "Winter's going to hit hard this year. Mountain men are saying so." She gathered her coat tighter. "Don't let your waterline freeze." She rode back south. Rowena ate the bean soup standing in the doorway, watching her go, and thought about her father and about what he'd said about this land having good bones, and about the seed box she still hadn't opened. She opened it on the first Sunday of November, when the first real snow had come and gone and left the world white and muffled and very still. The box was cedar, about the size of a large Bible, fitted with a simple latch. Inside, everything was carefully organized. Paper envelopes, cloth pouches, small glass vials with cork stoppers, each one labeled in her father's small, precise handwriting. Most of the labels meant nothing to her. Latin names, abbreviations from his notebook. A few she recognized: chamomile, valerian, calendula. But the largest section of the box, taking up nearly 1/3 of the space, was given over to one particular plant. 7 separate envelopes, each holding dozens of seeds, all labeled with the same notation: E. purpura, medicinal grade, Shoshone River Valley stock. She knew what echinacea was. Her father had talked about it. More than talked about it. Had spent months, maybe years, learning about it from every source he could find. The medicinal properties. The market in the East, where demand from patent medicine companies was growing faster than domestic cultivation could meet. The specific quality of certain Western strains, which old herbalists and new pharmaceutical buyers alike considered superior to anything grown in the cultivated fields of the Midwest. Her father's notebook was in the box too, tucked in a side pocket. She'd read most of it over the summer, but now she sat by the stove with the notebook and read it again more slowly, looking for the specific pages about the echinacea. Found them. Read for an hour while the wind pressed against the sod walls. Her father had done the math in the margins. Yield per acre. Price per pound of dried root. The market contact in Denver, a man named Aldous Vance, a specialty buyer who corresponded with pharmaceutical importers on the East Coast. The note next to Vance's name said, "Fair dealing, knows the market, will not cheat if you come prepared." She closed the notebook and looked at the window, which was just oilskin and darkness beyond. Her father had known exactly what this land was for. He'd chosen it for this purpose. The broken drainage that Dale Brennan thought was a flaw. That was partial shade, north-facing slopes. The specific moisture conditions that echinacea wanted. The isolation that the lawyers thought made the land worthless. That was privacy. Distance from curious eyes. Porter Ashcroft had been thinking about this for a long time. She put the notebook back in the box, banked the stove, and went to sleep. Boy? She planted in late April, when the ground had thawed enough to work and the last hard frost had passed. It took her 9 days. Not because the work was complex, The planting itself was straightforward, and her father's instructions were clear about spacing and depth and the preparation of the beds. It took 9 days because she was doing it alone, with hand tools, on 3 acres of ground that had never been broken, and because she was careful. She was slow on purpose. Her father's notes had said that medicinal-grade root was about patience as much as anything else. You didn't rush the preparation. You got it right the first time. She sang while she worked sometimes, old songs she only half remembered, talked to herself other times, or to Juniper, who watched from the fence with the expression of an animal that had seen everything and was impressed by none of it. Once she found herself talking to her father, which embarrassed her even with no one around to hear it, but she kept doing it anyway. The fields were in the northern sections of the property, tucked into the creek draw where the hills created a natural windbreak and where the slope gave her the drainage and the partial shade her father's notes specified. From the wagon track that constituted the only real road through this part of the territory, you couldn't see the planted areas at all. You'd have to walk onto the property specifically to find them. That was by design, too. She was careful about the neighbors, not unfriendly. She helped Dale Brennan pull a cow out of a mud hole one afternoon in May without being asked, and she'd become something like friendly with Clara over the months, stopping by for coffee on Sundays when the work allowed. But she didn't talk about what she was planting. When Clara asked about the property in that careful, indirect way that frontier people had, Rowena said she was trying a kitchen garden and some medicinal herbs, which was true as far as it went. "Herbs," Clara said, in a tone that suggested she found this eccentric but harmless. "My mother grew them. I know how to work with them." Clara looked at her over her coffee cup. "There money in that?" "Enough," Rowena said. By midsummer, the plants were coming in strong. She'd worried through May and June that she'd done something wrong. The seedlings had come up patchy in places, slower than she'd hoped, and one section of the low field had developed a drainage problem she hadn't anticipated. She'd spent a week redigging channels by hand, her boots soaked through every day, the clay sucking at her feet like it had an opinion about the matter. By the time she'd fixed it, she'd lost maybe a fifth of that section. But what remained was healthy. Better than healthy. By July, the plants were knee-high, the characteristic purple flowers starting to open, and when she crouched in the rows and looked down the length of them, she thought her father would have been pleased. Maybe more than pleased. She wrote her first letter to Aldous Vance in Denver in late July. Careful, businesslike, saying only that she had echinacea coming to harvest in the fall, medicinal grade, from the stock he might remember her father mentioning, and asking whether he'd be in the market. She didn't say how much. She didn't say where exactly. Her father's notebook had a section on negotiation that she'd read 3 times. "Never show your hand before you know who you're dealing with," it said. "A buyer who knows your situation is a buyer who knows how little you can afford to refuse." She mailed the letter on a supply run to the small town of Harker's Crossing, 12 miles east. Vance's reply came 3 weeks later, forwarded by the postmaster who'd left it tucked in the general store's pigeonhole slots with her name written on it in a secretary's neat hand. He was interested. Very interested. He'd like to know more. She wrote back, still careful, still not showing the hand. But when she sealed that second letter and rode back to the post office, she was smiling, just a little, in a way she hadn't smiled since before her father got sick. The trouble started small, the way trouble usually does. In August, a man named Cutter, she never got a first name, came by the property asking about water rights. He said he was a surveyor working for a land development company out of Cheyenne that was looking at creek access in the area. He was polite enough, had a good horse and new boots that hadn't seen much actual outdoor work. He looked at the property in that particular way men sometimes looked at things they were already figuring out how to take. "Nice piece of ground," he said, though his tone implied the opposite. "It suits me," Rowena said. "You growing anything? This and that? Kitchen garden?" He'd looked north, toward the creek draw where the fields were. She'd watched him look, watched his eyes and what they did. "Mind if I walk the property line for the survey?" "I mind," she said. "You can see the creek from the road. That's enough for a water rights survey." He'd looked at her then, reassessing. She'd been polite the whole time, hadn't raised her voice, had the rifle leaning against the doorframe behind her where it was visible but not aggressive. He made some notes in his book, thanked her for her time, and rode south. She watched him go until he was over the ridge and out of sight. Then she went inside and sat at the table for a long time. "Utan," I need to ask you something, she said to Clara Brennan 2 days later, over the Sunday coffee. Clara set her cup down. Something in Rowena's voice had shifted her posture slightly. Go ahead. Man came by my property, said he was a surveyor, name of Cutter. Clara was quiet for a moment. What did he look like? Rowena described him. Clara's expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes did. I've seen that man, Clara said. He came by here too about a month back. Same story. Water rights survey. You let him walk the property? Dale did. Clara picked her cup back up. What's your concern? Rowena thought about what to say, about how much to say. I think he's working for someone who's interested in what I'm growing. Clara looked at her steadily. Which is? Medicinal herbs, my father's project. She watched Clara's face. It's a legal crop. Valuable if you grow the right variety. And I think someone's been watching my property. Clara was quiet for a long time. The clock on her mantel ticked. Outside, wind moved through the grass. There's a man in town, Clara said finally. Harker's Crossing. Name of Good. Elias Good. He's a land speculator. Been buying up claims in this section for 2 years now, anything he can get cheap, and reselling them to Eastern investors. She paused. He had a run-in with your father once. I don't know the details. Your daddy didn't talk much about business. What kind of run-in? The kind where nobody says exactly what it was about. Clara set her coffee down again, this time with a finality to it. I'll tell you what I know for certain. Elias Good doesn't bother with land that isn't worth bothering with. If he's sending men to look at your property, he thinks there's something there worth having. Rowena drove home slowly that afternoon, watching the ridges. She found the tracks on a Thursday morning. She'd gotten in the habit of walking the perimeter of the planted fields at first light, partly to check the plants, partly because the habit made her feel better, though she wouldn't have admitted that to anyone. She'd been doing it for a month, and it had become as natural as drawing water. On this particular morning, in the soft dirt along the north edge of the lower field, she found boot prints. 2 sets. Large men, both of them, walking slowly between the rows. They'd been careful, hadn't damaged any plants, hadn't broken anything. But they'd walked the full length of the field and back out, and she could see where they'd crouched down at one point, likely pulling a plant to look at the root. She crouched next to the impression herself for a moment. The ground was still cool. The tracks weren't fresh, but last night, maybe the night before. She walked the rest of the field slowly, looking for more. Found a third set of tracks on the far end of the upper field. Someone had stood at the edge for a long time, the impression deep and settled, looking down the rows. Just standing there, watching. When she came back to the cabin, she sat on the step and thought about it until the sun was fully up and the morning cold had eased a little. She wasn't surprised. She'd known something like this was coming. But knowing it was coming and having the boot prints in front of you were 2 different feelings. She went inside, made coffee, sat at the table with her father's notebook and turned to the section she'd only skimmed before because she hadn't needed it yet. The section he'd titled, in his careful hand, What to Do When Others Know What You Have. The days shortened. September came in with a chill that tasted like real winter, the kind that didn't let go. The echinacea was past flowering, the petals dropped, and the roots were swelling toward their autumn richness. Her father's notes said fall was the optimal harvest time, when the plant had stored the whole season's energy in the root, and the medicinal value was at its peak. She was, she estimated, 6 weeks from harvest. The valley felt different to her now. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way a rider on the far ridge would stop and not move for too long. The twice-cut trail she found in the scrub north of the property, where someone had passed through on foot and then passed through again within a day or 2. Small things. A broken branch, a fire ring, cold, in a hollow a half-mile from her north fence line. They were patient, whoever they were. She'd give them that. They were watching and waiting and not doing anything that she could point to as trespassing or threat. Just watching. She wrote to Aldous Vance again. This letter was different from the others, more direct, more specific. She told him she had approximately 2.5 acres of mature echinacea root coming to harvest in mid-October. She told him the quality of the root and why she believed it was premium grade. She told him her price per pound, which was firm, and she told him she needed a buyer who could move fast and keep quiet. She read the letter over twice, added one more line at the bottom. Time may be a factor. I'd appreciate a prompt reply. She mailed it the next morning before dawn, riding to Harker's Crossing in the dark and leaving it in the postmaster's box without stopping for anything else. Something wrong? Dale Brennan asked her one afternoon. She'd stopped by to return a borrowed fence stretcher, and Dale had found her standing at the fence looking north toward her property with an expression he apparently found readable. Why do you ask? You've got the look, he said. He was a big, plain-spoken man who'd been ranching this valley for 15 years and had no interest in conversation for its own sake. When he talked, it meant something. Like somebody's been in your grain, she considered him. Dale wasn't a man who'd be useful to have as an enemy, and he also wasn't a man who gossiped. Clara had vouched for him without exactly saying so, in that indirect way Clara had. You know a man named Good in town? She asked. Elias Good? Dale's face didn't change, but something in his jaw tightened slightly. Know of him. He's had men on my property. A pause. You sure about that? Sure enough. Dale was quiet. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands, put it back on. What are you growing up there that's worth his interest? Medicinal root crop, my father's project. Valuable? If I get to harvest it, yes. Dale looked at the fence post he'd been working on, then at the ground, then back at her. He wasn't a man who made decisions quickly, which probably meant when he made them, they tended to hold. You need help, he said. You come tell me first. I appreciate that. I mean it. Not saying it to be polite. He picked up his fence stretcher and went back to work. Good's not a man who stops because you ask him to. She rode home with that sitting in her chest, turning it over. It wasn't reassuring exactly, but it was good to know someone in this valley had eyes open. She started sleeping in shorter stretches. She'd always been a light sleeper. Her father had been too. Something he'd told her came from years of living alone. But now she was waking at every sound, every shift in the wind, every time Juniper moved in the lean-to. She'd get up, take the rifle, walk to the door, and listen into the dark. Mostly nothing. Coyotes once. A deer moving through the creek draw one night, which took 10 years off her life before she realized what it was. She was tired. More tired than she'd been all summer, which was saying something, because summer had been brutal, but she couldn't afford to miss anything. The letter from Vance came in the first week of October. She read it twice standing in the postmaster's doorway because she couldn't wait until she got home. Vance was coming north. He'd be in Casper by October 14th, and he could reach her from there. He had a crew available if she needed it. He had a buyer in Chicago already tentatively interested. She rode home faster than she should have, the horse breathing hard by the time she got the gate open, and she stood in her own kitchen and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in months, the possibility that this might actually work. She put the letter in the seed box, banked the stove, picked up the rifle, and walked out to check the fields in the gathering dusk of an October evening, the air sharp enough to cut, the plants dark and quiet in their rows, and somewhere on the ridge above her, probably somebody watching. Let them watch, she thought. 6 more weeks. She just had to get through 6 more weeks. She walked back to the cabin in the dark without a lantern, because she'd learned the shape of her own land by then, every slope and hollow. She didn't need a light. She knew exactly where she was. The letter from Vance sat in the seed box for 3 days before Rowena let herself read it a 3rd time. She wasn't superstitious. She didn't believe in signs or omens, but she'd learned over the last year that hope was its own kind of danger, the way it made you careless, made you stop watching, made you start counting money you hadn't earned yet. So she read the letter once, put it away, and went back to work. Checked the fields, hauled water, patched a section of fence along the east boundary that Juniper had been testing with his nose every morning like he was looking for a weakness. On the 4th day, she read it again, just to make sure she hadn't imagined the important parts. She hadn't. Vance was coming. He had a buyer. He thought her price was fair. She folded the letter back into its envelope and let herself sit with that for exactly 5 minutes, which was all she felt she could safely afford. Then she went outside and found fresh tracks along her north fence line. These weren't like the careful prints she'd found in August, the ones that suggested patience and observation. These were different. Two men moving fast, not trying particularly hard to hide their passage, the boot heels digging in deep the way they do when someone is walking with purpose rather than stealth. They'd come along the fence, stopped at the gate latch, and then moved east along the boundary toward the creek draw. She followed them to where they ended, at the edge of the upper field. Whoever had been here had stood at the field's edge and looked, and then turned around and gone back the way they'd come. There was a smear on the top fence rail where one of them had leaned on it. She looked at the smear for a long time. They weren't being careful anymore. That was the part that sat wrong in her stomach on the long walk back to the cabin. August had been careful. September had been careful. Whatever was happening now was something else, a shift in calculation somewhere, a decision that the patience phase was over. She stood in the kitchen and thought about it while the coffee heated on the stove. 6 weeks until ideal harvest. Vance arriving in Casper on the 14th. She needed the root to stay in the ground as long as possible. Her father's notes had been explicit about that the medicinal value peaked in mid to late October when the plant had finished its cycle and drawn everything back down into the root system. An early harvest meant lower quality, lower price. Less money at exactly the moment when she needed all of it. She poured her coffee and stood at the window looking north. The problem was that someone else was also doing math, and their math didn't care about root quality. She rode into Harker's Crossing the next morning for supplies she didn't strictly need yet, because she wanted to look at the town with fresh eyes. A year ago she'd been new here, anonymous, just another homesteader's daughter. Things were different now. She could feel it in the way the feed store clerk watched her a beat too long when she came in. In the way two men outside the land office stopped their conversation and tracked her down the street. Small town in a territory that ran on information. Somebody had been talking. She was loading the supply sacks onto the wagon when a man came out of the land office and walked toward her with the casual deliberateness of someone who'd been waiting for her to show up. He was maybe 50, heavy through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had probably once been handsome and had settled into something harder with age. Well-dressed in a way that wasn't frontier dress. His coat was Eastern cut, expensive, slightly out of place in the dust and raw lumber of Harker's Crossing. He had the walk of a man who'd gotten what he wanted enough times that he'd stopped thinking about it. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. Not a question. She tied off the last sack and turned to face him fully. "That's me." Elias Good. He put out his hand. She didn't take it right away, just looked at it, then at him, then took it briefly. His grip was firm and practiced. "I knew your father." "I know who you are," she said, "and I know you knew him." Something crossed his face. Not embarrassment, not quite. More like the slight recalibration of a man who'd expected a different opening. "Then you probably know I always dealt fairly with Porter. I know you had a disagreement with him about the property." "A discussion," Good said easily. "Men in business have discussions. It didn't end any particular way." He looked at her wagon, at the modest supplies. "You're managing out there alone." "I am." "That's admirable." His tone made admirable sound like the polite word for foolish. "Wyoming winters are hard on solo operations, especially first years. I've had some help from neighbors. The Brennans." He said it like he knew the Brennans well enough to have already assessed their usefulness. "Good people. Limited resources." She looked at him directly. She'd promised herself before she rode in that if she ran into Good, and she'd half expected to because small towns had a way of arranging these things, she wasn't going to show him anything he could use. No anger, no nerves, just a woman who had somewhere to be. "Mr. Good," she said, "I appreciate you introducing yourself. Was there something specific you wanted to talk about?" He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him deciding something. How direct to be, maybe, or how much he'd already decided she knew. "I'll be plain," he said. "I'm aware you've put in a medicinal crop. Word gets around in a valley this small. I have buyers interested in specialty crops, and I'd be happy to talk about purchasing what you've got coming to harvest." "I have a buyer," she said. "That's so." Not a question. He was looking at her in a way that was meant to seem casual, but wasn't. "Denver buyer? Specialty market?" She didn't answer that. "Because that market's thin," he continued. "Specialty buyers, they come and go. Travel plans change. You want to move a perishable crop in a narrow window, you want someone who's already local. Already has transport arranged. He smiled, and it was a real smile, which was almost worse than if it hadn't been. I could make this simple for you. Simple, she said. Fair price. Quick transaction. You'd be paid before first frost. She pulled on her gloves, reached for the wagon's seat rail. Mr. Good, I appreciate the offer. I'll keep it in mind. Miss Ashcroft. His voice changed register slightly. Still pleasant, but with something under it now, the way a river sounds different when you can't see the bottom. This territory gets hard on people who try to carry everything alone. I've watched it happen more times than I'd like to count. Your father was a smart man, smart enough to know when to be practical. She was up on the seat now. She gathered the reins and looked down at him. My father was smart enough to keep the land, she said. Have a good day, Mr. Good. She moved Juniper forward without waiting for an answer and didn't look back until she was around the bend in the road, and then only to make sure nobody was following. She told Dale Brennan about it the next afternoon, riding south to find him. He was out mending the south pasture fence, and he listened to the whole account without interrupting, his hands still working the wire. He'll come back with a number, Dale said when she was done. I know. Higher than you'd expect, probably. That's how he works. He goes high enough that the person starts thinking maybe it's foolish to turn it down. And if you turn it down anyway, Dale pulled the wire taut and wrapped it around the post with a practiced twist. Depends on how much he wants what you've got. She sat with that. How much trouble has he made for people before? Dale was quiet long enough that she knew he was thinking about specific instances, not the general answer. Nothing you could take to a sheriff, he said finally. Good's too smart for that, but there was a family named Perch, 2 valleys over, about 3 years back. Had a timber claim he wanted. They declined to sell. Come spring, they had a boundary dispute that dragged on 2 seasons. A couple of their hands quit in a way that seemed sudden. Their grazing access on the east side got complicated. He picked up the fence pliers and moved to the next post. By the time it was over, they'd sold to him, for less than his original offer. Rowena looked at the mountains for a moment. So he waits you out. When he can. Or he makes the situation uncomfortable enough that waiting becomes hard. And the men he's sending onto my property, Dale stopped working. He turned to look at her properly. He sent men onto your land? Twice that I've found sign of, maybe more. That's trespassing. It is, but it's also just looking, nothing I could make a case of. She watched his face. I'm not asking you to get involved, Dale. I just want to know what I'm dealing with. He was quiet again in that deliberate way of his. Then he said, How long till your harvest? 6 weeks? Maybe 5.5? He nodded, turned back to the fence. Then that's how long you need to manage this. It wasn't a solution, but it was the clearest statement of the situation she'd heard from anyone, and she drove home feeling, oddly, a little better for having it laid out that plainly. The second week of October came cold. She'd started keeping the rifle inside the cabin door at night rather than in the lean-to, which she told herself was just practical. She'd also started leaving Juniper in the small interior pen rather than the outside paddock, which meant the smell was something she had to get used to, but which meant she'd hear him if anyone came close to the property in the dark. She slept in her clothes most nights. She'd written to Vance again, a short note saying she'd be ready for him on the 14th as planned, that the crop was looking strong, and that she'd appreciate discretion on his end about the exact location and timing. She didn't spell out why. She didn't think she needed to. On the 12th, she found the note. It was tucked under a rock at the gatepost of the north field. Not left accidentally, deliberately placed where she'd find it on her morning walk. A piece of paper torn from some kind of ledger, folded once. She stood at the gate for a moment before picking it up, looking around at the ridge line, at the creek draw, at the pale morning sky. Then she unfolded it. Sell now or lose it all. Last reasonable offer. No signature. The handwriting was rough, hurried, not someone who wrote often. She stood there in the early morning cold with that piece of paper in her hand and felt something move through her that was almost calm. Not the calm of someone who wasn't afraid. She was afraid she'd learned over the last months that being unafraid was mostly a story people told themselves. But the calm of someone who'd already decided. She put the note in her coat pocket, finished her field walk, checked every row of every plant, counting, estimating, the same way she did every morning. The roots were where they needed to be. The plants had pulled down beautifully. 6 weeks ago, she'd have guessed the yield at 2.5 acres. Now, walking through them, she thought closer to 3 in effective harvestable terms, because the plants had spread into the margins better than she'd expected. Her father would have been pleased. She went back to the cabin and wrote to Vance again. Not the long, careful letters she'd been sending, just 4 lines. Situation has changed. I need you to be here on the 14th without delay. I believe I have less time than expected. Please confirm. She rode to town before dawn to get it in the mail before the morning post, and was back before full light, moving through the dark like she'd been born to it. 2 days later, she had company she hadn't expected. A woman she'd never met knocked on her cabin door in the early afternoon. Younger than Rowena had expected, maybe mid-20s, dark-haired, with the hands of someone who worked outside and the eyes of someone who watched everything. She introduced herself as Nora Hatch and said she'd been working as a cook and supply handler for a freighting outfit out of Casper until recently. "Aldous Vance sent me," Nora said. "He thought you might want someone on the ground before he arrives." Rowena looked at her carefully. "He didn't mention that in his last letter." "He sent me ahead of the letter, probably." Nora looked past her at the cabin, then at the property. "I've worked harvest logistics before, specialty crops mostly. He thought you might be dealing with some complications." "What made him think that?" "He said you used the phrase, 'situation has changed,' and someone who knows what they're doing doesn't use that phrase unless the situation has actually changed in a way that involves other people." Rowena was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, then." She made coffee, and Nora sat at the kitchen table and looked at the seed box and the rifle and the notebook without commenting on any of it, which Rowena found she respected. They talked for an hour. Nora was direct, not particularly warm, and seemed to approach problems the way a carpenter approaches a door that won't hang right, with the assumption that there's a solution if you look at it squarely enough. "Tell me about your yield," Nora said. 3 acres harvestable, maybe a little more." "Quality? As good as anything my father described in his notes? Better, maybe, because of how wet the spring was." Nora nodded. She had a way of listening that was fully attentive without being performative about it. "And you've got interested parties who want to intercept the crop. That's one way to put it. What's the man's name?" "Good. Elias Good. He's a land speculator out of Cheyenne with connections across the territory." Nora looked at the table for a moment. "I've heard that name, not specifically, just the type. They work in this territory." She looked up. "Here's your problem. If he knows a buyer is coming, he may try to move before the buyer arrives. Cause enough trouble with access, with transportation, with whatever pressure he can apply to make the harvest impossible in the window you need." "I know. So the question is whether you can create enough uncertainty about when the harvest happens that he can't time his interference." Rowena poured herself more coffee. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" She sat down across from Nora and looked at the table for a moment, at the grain of the wood, at the ring her coffee cup had left. Then she looked up. "I've been thinking about camping in the fields." Nora blinked. "At night?" "Starting now, until Vance arrives." A pause. "Alone." "I've been alone for a year," Rowena said. "I know the property in the dark. They don't." Nora was quiet, thinking. Not the dismissive silence of someone who'd already decided it was foolish, the working silence of someone running scenarios. "You'd want a fire position," she said finally. "Somewhere you can move from, not stay fixed. The drainage channel in the lower field. It runs east-west, gives me cover in both directions. And the rifle. And the rifle." Nora looked at her across the table. "I'll stay too," she said, and it was matter-of-fact, not heroic, the way she'd have said she'd take the second watch on a freight run. "I can't shoot worth a damn, but I can make noise, and I know how to handle a nervous situation without adding to it." Rowena felt something loosen slightly in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been tightened up for months. She hadn't known how much the aloneness of the thing had cost her, until someone offered to sit alongside it. "We start tonight," Rowena said. Nora nodded and put both hands around her coffee cup. "Then you'd better show me the layout of those fields before dark." Schwartz. They walked the property together in the thin afternoon light, Rowena talking, Nora listening and asking the occasional pointed question. The lower field, the upper field, the creek draw that connected them, the drainage channel that ran parallel to the lower field's north edge, the position of the gate, the ridge line to the north from which, Rowena had decided months ago, anyone watching the property would most naturally watch. And these are the plants? Nora had crouched down in one of the rows, looking at a mature plant with the root slightly exposed where the soil had washed thin around it. That's echinacea root. What's in the ground is what matters. The root's what they're buying. Nora touched the soil lightly. Your father planned all this. Every bit of it. He just didn't get to see it. Nora stood back up. She looked out over the field, the rows quiet in the late afternoon, the sky going orange and purple behind the ridge. Well, she said after a moment, he picked a good spot. He did, Rowena said, and she had to look away for a second because her throat had tightened up on her unexpectedly, the way grief did sometimes, coming at you sideways, at the moment you were least prepared for it, in the middle of the most ordinary kind of observation. They went back to this cabin and made supper. They didn't talk much while they ate. There wasn't much to say. They both knew what the night was and what it might bring, and what it definitely would bring in terms of cold and discomfort. Afterward, Rowena banked the stove and checked the rifle, and Nora wrapped herself in one of the spare blankets she'd brought in her saddle roll. They walked out into the dark together and found their positions in the drainage channel of the lower field. The stars were extraordinary. You forgot sometimes how many stars there were in Wyoming when there was no other light. The kind of sky that made you feel both very small and very awake. They settled in. The cold came down. Somewhere in the creek draw a night bird called once and then went quiet. Rowena lay with her back against the cold earth of the channel wall and the rifle across her lap and watched the ridge line. She thought about her father standing on that ridge the spring before he died, telling her the land had good bones. She thought about the lawyers in Tilden with his too-tight collar. She thought about Elias Good in his Eastern-cut coat, standing in the dust of Harker's Crossing with his hand out, using the word practical like it was a gift he was offering her. The night was long. The cold was serious. Her back would hurt in the morning in ways it was already beginning to preview. She didn't move from the channel. Neither did Nora. They lay there in the dark among the plants that were going to matter, and waited to see what the night would bring. The first 2 nights in the field were cold and uneventful, and did particular damage to Rowena's lower back that she didn't mention to Nora because there was nothing useful to say about it. They'd settled into a rough rotation, 2 hours watching, 1 hour resting, though resting was a generous word for what you could accomplish lying in a drainage channel in October with frost forming on the grass above your head. Nora turned out to be a better night companion than Rowena had expected. She didn't talk unnecessarily. She stayed awake when she was supposed to and didn't complain about it. When the cold got serious around 3 in the morning of the second night, she produced a second flask of something that burned going down and said only, "Don't ask what's in it," which Rowena appreciated. By the third night, Rowena's body had made a kind of grim peace with the conditions. She lay in the channel and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead and thought about her father's notebook and the section she kept coming back to. Patience is not passive. Patience is sustained attention over time. He'd written that in the margin of the echinacea pages, and she hadn't understood it fully when she'd first read it. But she was beginning to understand it now, pressed into the cold earth of her own field with a rifle across her lap, watching a ridgeline she couldn't quite see. Nora was in the upper field tonight. They'd split the watch when it became clear that one person couldn't cover both adequately. Rowena had given her a signal, 3 sharp clicks of the metal canteen lid, if she heard anything. The night passed slowly. A half moon came up around midnight and gave enough light to see shapes, which was both better and worse than full dark. Better because she could see the field. Worse because she kept mistaking shadows for movement. She was in that particular state of tired that lives just beyond exhaustion, where everything sharpens instead of blurring, where small sounds become significant. When she heard it. Footsteps. Not one person. 2, maybe 3, moving along the north fence line with the particular quiet of people trying to be quiet, which is different from actual quiet. She'd spent enough nights out here to know the difference. She didn't move, didn't breathe loud. She pressed herself lower into the channel and turned her head slowly toward the sound. 2 men came through the gate. They'd brought something to work the latch quietly, which told her they'd been here before and thought about this. They moved into the lower field without hesitation, which also told her they knew the layout. In the half-moonlight, she could see them clearly enough. Both big, one carrying a short-handled spade. The other had a canvas sack folded over one arm. They walked to the nearest row, and the one with the spade knelt down and started working the soil around the base of a plant. She waited. She wanted to be sure of the number. Wanted to be sure there wasn't a third man she hadn't heard, still outside the fence, waiting. She counted to 20 in her head. Nothing moved at the fence. Nothing moved on the ridge. 2 men. That was it. She stood up from the drainage channel. "Leave it," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her a little. The 2 men froze. The one with the spade was still half crouched. Neither of them spoke. "I've got a Winchester aimed at the near one of you," she said, "which is you, with the shovel. Stand up slow and keep your hands where I can see them." A long pause, long enough that she was calculating what she'd do if it went the other direction. Then the man with the spade stood up. He put his hands out to his sides without being told to, which meant he'd been in situations with guns before and knew the protocol. "We're just looking," the second man said. He had a low voice, accent she couldn't place. "No harm intended." "You're in my field at 2 in the morning with a spade and a sack," she said. "That's past looking. We represent a party who's made you a fair offer. I know who you represent." She moved 2 steps to her right, keeping the channel behind her. She didn't want to be a fixed target if this went wrong. "That offer has been declined. Twice. This is the last time I'm going to say this. You are trespassing on private property, and I want you off it." The second man shifted his weight. It was a small movement, the kind a person makes when they're deciding something. "Don't," she said. Quiet, just the word. He went still. From somewhere up the slope came 3 sharp clicks of a metal canteen lid. The first man's head turned toward the sound. Something moved across his face. A recalculation. 1 woman he might have discounted. 2 people, one of them in an unknown position on the high ground, was a different problem. "We'll go," the first man said. He said it to the second man as much as to her, a decision being made in real time. "We'll go." "Leave the spade," Rowena said. A pause. Then the man set it down carefully, the way you set something down when you want to demonstrate that you're not leaving in anger, that this isn't over, that you're just making a tactical choice. They walked back the way they'd come, through the gate, and she listened to their footsteps until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she waited another 3 minutes, counting, watching the fence line. Nor came down from the upper field in the dark, moving carefully. 2? Nora said, low. 2. They're gone. You all right? Yes. She lowered the rifle. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking slightly, now that it was over. Not from fear exactly, more like her body catching up to what her mind had just done. I'm all right. They stood in the field together in the cold for a moment, not talking. They'll be back, Nora said. I know. Not tonight, but they'll come back with a plan that accounts for us. Rowena looked down at the spade lying on the ground between 2 rows of her plants. It was a cheap thing, handle worn smooth from use. Somebody's working tool, brought for this purpose. How many nights do we have before Vance gets here? Nora asked. 3. Maybe 4. Nora nodded slowly, looking at the fence line. Then we need to make those nights expensive for anyone who tries this again. In the morning, stiff and gray-eyed, they sat at the kitchen table and made a plan. It wasn't an elegant plan. Elegance wasn't the point. The point was to make the field difficult to approach without warning, and to make any approach carry consequences that would give even determined men a reason to reconsider. Rowena spent the morning stringing a length of thin cord at ankle height across the 3 primary approach paths to the fields. Not to stop anyone, but to make noise when they hit it, since she'd tied her spare tin cups to it at intervals. She felt slightly foolish doing it, but she also remembered something her father had said once. The best alarm doesn't have to stop anyone. It just has to wake you up in time. Nora spent the morning in a different direction entirely. She rode into Harker's Crossing alone, which Rowena had been hesitant about until Nora explained what she was going to do. I'm going to let it be known, Nora said before she left, that Mr. Aldous Vance of Denver is expected in this area within the week regarding a significant business transaction. Rowena stared at her. That's the opposite of discreet. Good already knows a buyer is coming. He's known for a while. The men he sent last night came prepared, which means he's been planning this move for days. The only thing discretion is protecting at this point is a fiction. Nora pulled her coat on. If Good knows the buyer is coming and knows when, it changes his calculation. Right now he thinks he has time to pressure you, to slow things down, to make the harvest messy enough that you'll take his lower offer just to be done with it. If he knows Vance is already on his way and the transaction is nearly completed, he might try to move faster, Rowena said, or he might decide the opportunity has closed. Nora paused. It's a gamble, but so is everything you've done this year. Rowena thought about it for a long moment. Then she nodded. Nora rode out. Rowena went back to the fields. She was working the far end of the upper field, checking plants, when she heard a horse on the road. She straightened and watched. It was Dale Brennan, riding direct rather than the long way around, which meant he was coming to her specifically. He pulled up at the fence and looked at her, looked at the spade she'd left leaning against the fence post rather than carry it back to the lean-to yet. That's not yours, he said. No. He got off his horse and tied it to the post without being invited to and walked toward her. His face had the look it had when he was carrying information he wasn't sure how to put down. You had company last night, he said. I did. They left quicker than they planned to. He looked at the field around them, at the mature plants in their rows. He hadn't been on this part of the property before, and she watched him see it properly for the first time. The scale of it, the health of it, the careful work of the whole season visible in a single long look. Lord Almighty, he said very quietly. And then, as if he'd caught himself, sorry, that's considerable, Rowena. Yes, it is. He looked at her. Good's in town this morning. She felt that settle in her chest. Is he? Arrived last night. He's at the hotel. Had breakfast with two men I don't recognize, not local. Eastern clothes. One of them had a leather case like a lawyer carries. He paused. Clara saw them and sent me out. Lawyers, Rowena said, or something that functions like lawyers. Dale turned his hat in his hands. If he's brought legal representation, he might be looking at some kind of injunction, some paper that freezes your ability to harvest or sell while a dispute is, I don't know, I'm not a legal man, but that's what it looks like. Rowena stood very still. She hadn't thought of that angle. She'd been thinking about physical threats, about men in the field at night, about pressure and intimidation. She hadn't thought about paper. Can he do that? She asked. Is there anything he could claim a dispute over? Your daddy's transaction with him, whatever that was. Dale looked at her carefully. Do you know the details? Not exactly. My father's notes mentioned Good, but only in passing. Something about an earlier offer on the property that my father turned down. If Good can argue there was a prior agreement, even a disputed one, even an informal one, a friendly judge might issue a temporary hold on the property's commercial use. He said it carefully, like a man who'd looked at enough land disputes to know how these things worked without being directly involved in them. A temporary hold doesn't have to be permanent to do the damage. It just has to last long enough. Long enough to miss the harvest window. Long enough for Vance to leave and not come back this season. Long enough for the roots to go past peak and lose their value, or for the weather to turn and lose the crop entirely. She thought about her father's notebook, turned back to the early pages in her memory, the Ohio pages, before Wyoming. Document everything, he'd written. The man who has paper wins the argument even when he's wrong, and is formidable when he's right. My father's correspondence, she said slowly. He kept everything, every letter, every receipt. There would be something from whatever contact he had with Good. Where is it? In the trunk. She was already moving toward the cabin. Come on. They went through this trunk together, Dale sitting on the step outside because the cabin was too small for two people to work comfortably, Rowena handing him pages while she sorted. Her father had been meticulous, which had annoyed her when she was young, and now felt like a gift she hadn't earned. Letters organized by year, receipts bundled with twine, his correspondence sorted by sender. She found the Good file within 20 minutes. There wasn't much, but what was there was clear. A letter from Good to her father dated 2 years ago, offering to purchase the property outright at a price that was decent but below fair market for land with water access. Her father's reply, a copy in his own hand, which was how he'd kept records, declining politely, citing that he intended to develop the land himself. A second letter from Good, the price higher, with some additional language about the letter constituting a formal first right of refusal if the property ever changed hands. Her father's reply to that one was shorter. I acknowledge your letter, but do not accept the terms described as binding on my part. I have not agreed to a right of first refusal and do not intend to. She sat on the step with that letter and felt something that was close to relief, though it was cautious relief. That second letter, Dale said, reading over her shoulder, Good's trying to argue the right of first refusal exists. But my father's reply disputes it clearly. Dale took the paper and held it in better light. Your father was sharp. He knew what Good was trying to do and he answered it directly. He handed it back. You need to get this to someone who can use it before Good files anything. Vance will know lawyers in Casper, Rowena said, half to herself. Vance arrives when? 2 days, if he's on schedule. Dale stood up. He looked out at the road, then back at her. 2 days is a long time if Good moves tomorrow. She folded the letter carefully and put it with the others in a bundle. Her mind was moving fast, the way it did when the problem was clear and the options were limited and you had to pick one without being sure it was right. I need to ride to Casper, she said. Dale looked at her. That's a long day and a night. Round trip. I know. She looked at the fields, at the cord with the tin cups she'd strung this morning. If I leave tonight after dark and ride hard, I can reach Casper by morning, find Vance before he leaves for here, bring him back with whatever legal help he has access to, and leave the property. With Nora here, and she looked at him. I'm not asking, Dale. I know you've got your own. I'll come by tonight, he said, like she hadn't been in the middle of a sentence. And tomorrow, if need be. Check in on things. He picked up his hat. Clara would come too, but she's got the youngest sick. She looked at him for a moment. He wasn't a demonstrative man. He'd given her more over the last months than he'd probably given many people, in that particular frontier way of giving that involved actions and not words. Thank you, she said. He shrugged, which meant he'd heard her. Ride safe and ride fast, he said, and take that bundle of papers with you. She left at 10 that night. She'd given Nora the full account, Good in town, the lawyers, the plan, and Nora had listened without expression and then said, Go, I've got this end. Rowena had looked at her. You sure? I've handled worse than 2 men with a spade, Nora said, and Dale will be by. Go. She packed the document bundle in her saddlebag, wrapped in oilskin against weather, took the rifle, left Juniper in the cabin pen because she was taking her better horse, the roan she'd bought from Dale in the spring and which had more miles in her. The night ride was brutal, cold straight through in a way that the layers couldn't fully address, the road visible by starlight and occasional moonlight, and then, for a stretch of 2 hours in the middle, by almost nothing, just the roan's sense of where the ground was and Rowena's trust in that. She stopped twice to let the horse drink where she knew water crossings were, and once to dismount and walk for 20 minutes because her legs had gone partly numb and she needed the circulation back. She reached Casper at 5 in the morning, the sky just beginning to gray in the east. She found the hotel Vance had mentioned in his letter and woke the front desk clerk, who woke Vance, who came downstairs in a coat thrown over his nightclothes, and looked at her, mud-spattered, hollowed out with fatigue, documents in her hand, with the expression of a man who has dealt with complicated business his entire life and had just encountered a new variety of it. Miss Ashcroft, he said. Mr. Vance. She put the documents on the table in front of him. I need you to look at these, and I need to know if you have a lawyer. He sat down, picked up her father's letters, read through them twice with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood what he was looking at. Then he looked up at her. Sit down, he said. You look like you're about to fall over. I'm fine. You look like someone who rode through the night and hasn't eaten. I'm fine, she said again, but she sat down because her legs were making that argument for her. He called for coffee and something to eat from the kitchen boy who appeared in the hallway. Then he spread the letters on the table between them. Your father was thorough, he said. This reply he wrote. This is important. This is him refusing the right of first refusal in explicit terms. Any lawyer worth anything could use this. Can Good file an injunction? He can file anything. The question is whether it holds. Vance picked up the second letter again. With this in hand, I don't think it holds. But he might file anyway, just to slow things down. He looked at her across the table. How long do we have? The roots need to come out no later than the 20th. After that, the ground freezes and the work gets significantly harder. The crop loses nothing in the cold itself, but extraction. The 20th is 6 days. He was already calculating. She could see it. I have a crew in Casper. 4 men, experienced with root harvest. They came up from Colorado last season for exactly this kind of work. If we move tomorrow, today, she said. He looked at her. Today, she said again. I think Good files something tomorrow if he thinks he still has a chance. If we're already on the property harvesting when whatever paper he's prepared lands, it's too late for the paper to matter. Vance was quiet for a long moment. The coffee arrived and he wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at nothing in particular. You've thought about this a great deal, he said. I've had nothing else to think about for 6 weeks. He nodded slowly. Then he said, Eat something. I need an hour to get the crew together and get the wagons loaded. We leave at 7. She ate. She wasn't hungry. The exhaustion was past hunger, but she ate because she knew she'd need it. The food tasted like nothing in particular, and she ate it anyway, mechanically, watching the gray morning come through the window of the hotel dining room. She thought about Nora in the field, about Dale Brennan checking the perimeter in the early morning, about Elias Good at the hotel in Harker's Crossing, eating his breakfast with his lawyers, making his calculations. She thought about her father standing on that ridge. Good bones, he'd said. She'd planted something in those bones and watched it grow for a full season. She'd slept in the cold ground beside it. She'd ridden through a black Wyoming night to protect it. It was hers. All of it was hers. She pushed her plate aside and sat up straight and waited for 7 o'clock. They left Casper at 5 minutes past 7, not on the hour as Vance had planned, because one of the wagon wheels needed a pin replaced, and the crew's lead man, a broad-shouldered Coloradan named Tess, who turned out to be a woman in her 40s with forearms like a blacksmith, refused to move until it was done right. Lose a wheel on the road and we lose half the day, Tess said, flat and final, while she worked the pin into place with a mallet. She didn't look up while she said it. Vance had glanced at Rowena. Rowena had said nothing. Tess was right, and they all knew it. So they left at 7:05, 2 wagons and 5 people, including Rowena, moving north out of Casper into a morning that was cold and clear and smelled like coming snow. Vance rode alongside the lead wagon on a gray horse, and Rowena rode the roan, and the 4 crew members, Tess and 3 men, whose names Rowena collected one at a time over the first hour of riding, Roy, Dolph, and a young one called Mac, who couldn't have been more than 17 and didn't talk much, occupied the wagon beds with the equipment. Vance had done this before. That was clear from how the wagons were loaded. Not just tools, but the whole infrastructure of a field harvest, crates for the roots, burlap for bundling, a small scale for spot weighing, even a tarp and pole arrangement that could be erected quickly to keep the dug roots out of direct sunlight during transport. He'd pulled this kind of job together fast because he'd pulled this kind of job together before, and he knew which parts mattered and which parts you could improvise. The lawyer, Rowena said, riding beside him in the first hour. You said you had access to one. In Casper, I sent him a note before we left. Vance kept his eyes on the road. He's going to look at your father's correspondence and prepare a response to any injunction filing. If Good files today, there'll be an answer ready by tomorrow morning. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we harvest. He said it simply. An injunction on a crop that's already been harvested and transported is substantially less useful than an injunction on a crop still in the ground. That's not a legal opinion. That's just arithmetic. Good will know that too. Yes, Vance said, which is why we're moving today. She thought about that for a while. About Good in his hotel room, eating breakfast, receiving information through whatever network he'd built in this valley. About whether someone had already told him she'd ridden to Casper last night. About how fast information moved in a territory this size when someone with resources wanted it to move. Can your crew work fast? She asked. Vance looked at Tess on the wagon ahead of them. Tess pulled 3 acres of valerian root in 1 day last year outside Colorado Springs. 4 people. Good ground. He paused. Your ground is good? Better than good. Then yes, he said. They can work fast. They arrived at the property at 10:30. Nora was at the gate, which meant she'd heard them coming and come out to meet them rather than waiting inside, which also meant she'd been alert and watching all morning. She looked tired in the particular way of someone who hadn't slept much but was running on the kind of focus that substitutes for sleep in short bursts. Quiet night after you left, she told Rowena. Dale came by at 6 this morning, walked the perimeter, didn't find anything. He's coming back this afternoon. No one on the road this morning, coming or going. One rider, early, moving south toward Harker's Crossing. I couldn't make out the face. Rowena thought about that. Someone who'd been watching the property overnight and was now heading back to town to report. She looked at Vance. We start now, she said. Tess had already climbed down from the wagon and was walking toward the north field without waiting to be told, looking at the ground, crouching to examine a plant, standing back up to look at the rows and calculate. By the time Rowena and Vance caught up with her, she'd already handed tools to Roy and Dolph and was saying something to Mac in a low voice that involved specific hand gestures Rowena didn't fully follow. Upper field first or lower? Tess asked, turning to Rowena. Lower's closer to the road. If someone comes, upper first, Tess said, making the decision before Rowena finished the sentence. Work down. Anyone coming from the road sees an empty lower field first, buys us time. She looked at Rowena steadily. You said the root is mature through both fields? Both fields. Upper might be 2 or 3 days more peaked, but both are harvestable. Good enough. Tess turned back to her crew. Upper field, let's go. Rowena watched them move into position, the efficiency of people who'd done this together before. No wasted motion, no questions about where to stand or how to organize the rows. Roy started at the east end, Dolph at the west, working toward each other. Mac followed behind with the crates, and Tess worked the center rows herself, her spade moving with the rhythm of long practice. You have a good crew, Rowena said to Vance. I pay them like I do. He was watching the field too. Tess has been with me 4 years. She came from market farming in Missouri, knew root crops better than anyone I'd worked with. The others I picked up over time. He paused. They know how to be quiet about what they've handled. That's worth as much as the speed. Nora had drifted to the fence line and was watching the road. Rowena joined her for a moment. Go help them, Nora said without looking at her. I'll watch the road. That's what's useful right now. Rowena looked at her. You've been up all night and you rode to Casper and back, Nora said. And you're still standing here looking at me like you need permission to go work your own field. Go. She went. The work was hard, and it was good. That was the thing about physical labor at a moment of crisis. It gave you somewhere to put the tension. She took a row parallel to Roy's and worked it the way her father's notes had described. The spade angled to get underneath the root without severing it, loosening the soil in a circle before lifting, shaking the dirt off with a practiced knock against the spade handle. The roots came out heavy and dark, the smell of them rich and particular, something between earth and medicine. She'd smelled it all season in small doses. At harvest scale, it was overwhelming in the best possible way. Roy glanced over at her from his row. He had a weathered face and didn't offer opinions without invitation, but after watching her work for a few minutes, he gave a small nod that she interpreted as professional acknowledgement. She didn't say anything. She just kept working. By noon, they had the upper field half done. Tess called a 15-minute break for water and food, and they sat at the field's edge eating from the provisions Vance's crew had packed. It was plain food, bread, dried beef, hard cheese, and Rowena ate it like it was the best meal she'd had in months, which, relative to what she'd been subsisting on in the field at night, was arguably true. Pace? Vance asked Tess. Upper field done by 2, maybe 2:30, Tess said, chewing. Lower field is a full afternoon. We'll be finishing in the dark. That's fine, Rowena said. Tess looked at her. You have lanterns? 4, and Nora has 2. Tess nodded. She ate the rest of her bread and stood up before anyone else did and went back to her row. The crew followed without comment. At 1 in the afternoon, Dale Brennan arrived. He came at a trot, which was not Dale's usual pace, and Rowena saw his face before he reached the gate and felt her stomach tighten. Ryder came through town this morning, he said, dismounting fast. Word is Good filed something with the county clerk around 10 o'clock. I don't know the specifics. Clara heard it from the postmaster, who heard it from the clerk's assistant. He looked at the activity in the field, at the wagons, at Tess's crew moving through the upper rows. His expression shifted. "You started already." "Since 10:30, Vance said. He'd come up beside Rowena. "Whatever's been filed, it applies to a crop that is currently in the process of harvest and transport. The legal situation is significantly different." Dale looked at him. "You're Vance." "I am." "You have a lawyer?" "In Casper, already briefed on the correspondence." Vance's voice was measured. "Mr. Brennan, neighbor. Mr. Brennan, the filing will need to be served to be effective. Someone will need to physically present it to Miss Ashcroft. That takes time. It has to come from Harker's Crossing, which is 12 miles. If we're done harvesting before a server arrives—" "They could come today," Dale said. "They could," Vance agreed, "which is why we're working fast." Dale looked at the field again, at the loaded crates near the wagons, the routes already packed, the upper field moving toward done. He did the arithmetic of it the way he did everything, steadily, without rushing to a conclusion. "I'll stay on the road," he said finally. "Watch for anyone coming from the Harkers' direction. Give you as much warning as I can." "I'd appreciate that," Rowena said. He remounted and rode to the gate without further discussion. She watched him position himself where he could see the road's approach, and felt, again, that particular gratitude that had no good outlet, the kind you accumulate toward people who help you without making a performance of it. The upper field was finished at 20 minutes before 3. Tess walked the rows once after the last route was out, checking for anything missed, and found 3 plants they'd skipped in a section where the spacing had been irregular. She pulled those herself and added them to the last crate. Then she looked at the empty field, the worked soil, the cut stems lying flat, the holes where the roots had been, and said, "Good stand. Your father knew what he was planting." Rowena was standing at the field's edge. She looked at the bare ground for a moment, all that season's patience, visible now as absence. "He did," she said. "Lower field," Tess said, and turned and walked. They moved everything to the lower field and started fresh. It was 3 in the afternoon and the light was already angling low in the way it did in Wyoming October. That particular gold that was beautiful and also a reminder that the dark came fast and early. Rowena counted hours in her head. 4 of light, maybe 4.5. Then lanterns. She took a row and started. She was halfway through her 3rd row when Nora appeared at her elbow, moving quick from the fence line. "Someone on the road," Nora said, low. "Coming from the south, not Dale. Dale's still at the north gate. This is from the Harkers' direction." Rowena straightened, looked at Vance, who was near the wagon. "How many?" Vance asked. 2 riders and a buggy," Nora said. A buggy meant someone who was coming officially, or wanted to appear official. Rowena thought about the county clerk, about whatever Good had filed that morning, about the server Dale had warned them about. "How long?" she asked. 10 minutes, maybe. They're not rushing, but they're coming steady." Rowena looked at the field. Half done, maybe slightly more. She looked at Tess. "Can you finish without me?" she asked. Tess looked at the remaining rows. "We'll finish. Might be dark before the last of it, but we'll finish." "Then keep working." Rowena pulled off her work gloves. "Nora, stay with the crew. Vance, I need you with me. Outside." She met them at the main gate, which was the south gate, the one that faced the road from Harker's Crossing. She'd washed her hands in the water bucket and combed her hair back with her fingers, which was all there was time for. She stood at the gate post and waited. The buggy pulled up with the 2 riders flanking it. In the buggy was a man she didn't recognize, thin, in a dark coat, with a leather case on his lap. A court official or someone playing one. One of the riders she recognized as Cutter, the surveyor who'd come by in August. He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd expected to find her less ready than she was. The man in the buggy stepped down. He had the careful movements of someone who took his own authority seriously and wanted to make sure you noticed. "Miss Rowena Ashcroft?" he said. "That's me. I'm Deputy Clerk Harmon from the Harkers Crossing County office." He opened his case and produced a folded document. "I've been directed to present you with a temporary restraining order on commercial activity pertaining to any crop or agricultural product on this property, filed this morning by—" "Mr. Vance," Rowena said. Vance stepped up beside her. He took the document from Harmon before Harmon had quite finished extending it, and read it with the quick efficiency of someone who knew what to look for. His face didn't change. "This cites a right of first refusal alleged to exist in favor of Mr. Elias Good," Vance said, not looking up, "based on correspondence between Mr. Good and the late Porter Ashcroft." "That's correct," Harmon said. "We have documentation that explicitly disputes the existence of that right, written by Porter Ashcroft himself." Vance finally looked up. "This will not hold." "That may be true," Harmon said with the measured tone of a man who was only the messenger and knew it. "But until it is adjudicated—" "The property's harvest is already underway," Rowena said. She said it calmly, looking at Harmon directly and not at Cutter, because Cutter was the one she wanted to show nothing to. "The restraining order applies to initiating commercial agricultural activity. The activity was initiated this morning prior to this filing being served." Harmon blinked. He looked at the document, then at her, then back at the document. "The harvest has been ongoing for 5 hours," Vance said. "If you'd like to verify that, you're welcome to walk the property and observe." He folded the document and held it back out to Harmon. "And I'd suggest Mr. Good's lawyers look carefully at the date and timestamps on both the filing and the commencement of harvest before they decide how much further they want to push this." Harmon took the document back. He looked at Cutter, who looked at the gate, at the property behind it, at the complete absence of anything he could do about any of this. "I'll need to report back," Harmon said. "Of course," Rowena said. He got back in the buggy. The two riders turned their horses. She watched them go down the road toward Harker's Crossing, the buggy raising a thin trail of dust in the October afternoon. When they were small in the distance, she let herself breathe. They worked until 9 that night. The last 2 hours were by lantern light, 4 lanterns strung along the fence posts of the lower field, casting the kind of shadows that made everything look more dramatic than it already was. Mac turned out to be the fastest worker in low light. He moved by feel as much as sight, and his crates were always full first. Tess barely spoke for the last 3 hours, which Rowena had come to understand meant she was in her working concentration, the state where external information was unnecessary and possibly unwelcome. Nora stood at the fence with a lantern and watched the road, which by 9 o'clock was dark and empty and had been for hours. Dale had gone home after the buggy left, satisfied with how it had resolved, with the promise to Clara that he'd explain the whole thing over supper. He'd stopped to shake Vance's hand before he left, which from Dale constituted a significant endorsement. The last root came out of the ground at 9:20. Tess stood in the empty lower field and looked the length of it in the lantern light. Bare soil, cut stems, 3 acres of work, done. "That's your crop," she said to Rowena. Rowena looked at the loaded wagons, the crates stacked and strapped, the roots packed in burlap, the whole season's labor condensed into 2 wagon loads that smelled like dark earth and something older than either of them. She didn't say anything for a moment. Couldn't, actually. The season hit her all at once. The planting and the watching and the cold nights in the drainage channel and the ride to Casper and the men at the gate and all of it. And she stood in her harvested field in the lantern light and let it move through her without trying to stop it. "You all right?" Nora said from beside her. Quiet, not making a thing of it. "Yes," Rowena said. Her voice came out rough. She cleared her throat. "Yes, I'm all right." "It's a good amount of root," Nora said. "I'm not a specialist, but I can tell that much." Vance came to stand with them, looking at the wagons. He'd been doing mental calculations all afternoon. She could tell from the way he occasionally went still and moved his lips slightly. Now he looked settled, the calculation arrived at. "We move tonight," he said. "I'd rather not have those wagons sitting on your property overnight." "Agreed," Rowena said. "I'll need to discuss price in the morning when we can weigh everything properly in Casper, but—" He paused, and she'd learned enough about him over the day to know that a Vance pause meant something was coming that he'd thought carefully about. "Based on what I'm seeing, what I'm smelling, the quality of the rootstock, you should prepare yourself for a number that's higher than what we discussed in correspondence." She looked at him. "Your father's seed stock is exceptional," he said simply. "The buyer in Chicago is going to understand that immediately." She didn't respond to that right away. She looked at the wagons again, at the crates, at the dark field around them. Then she said, "When do you need an answer on transport?" "Now, ideally. If we're moving tonight, we move." "Move," she said. Tess was already at the lead wagon, checking the lashings on the crate stack. Roy and Dolph were hitching the teams. Mac was coiling rope with the focused energy of a young person at the end of a long day who still had something left. Rowena walked the perimeter of the lower field one last time, alone, with a lantern. She didn't know exactly why. It wasn't superstition, it was something closer to acknowledgement. The field had been the whole world for the last season, and she wanted to walk it once more when it was empty, when the work was done, before it became just a piece of ground again. Her boots made soft sounds in the worked soil. The lantern threw long shadows across the bare rows. The night was cold and absolutely clear, and above her the Wyoming sky was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and full of more stars than any one person could look at properly. She came back to the gate and blew out her lantern. The wagons were loaded, the crew was mounted and ready. Vance was waiting on his gray horse with the patient expression of a man who understood that there are moments you don't rush. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said, and swung up on the roan. They moved out of the property in a line, the wagons rolling slow and heavy on the road, the horse's breath clouding in the cold. Rowena pulled the gate shut behind her and latched it and rode to catch up with the others. She didn't look back at the field. She'd already said goodbye to it. What was in those wagons was the next thing now, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead. They reached Casper at 2 in the morning. The town was quiet in the way that small western towns are quiet at that hour. Not empty exactly, but folded in on itself, the saloons down to their last drinkers, the streets belonging to dogs, and the occasional night shift worker moving between shadows. The wagons made more noise than Rowena would have liked on the main street, the wheel rims loud on the frozen ground. But there was nothing to be done about that. You couldn't move 2 loaded wagons quietly. You just moved them. Vance had arranged storage at a freight warehouse on the north edge of town, owned by a man named Pell, who was already there when they arrived, lantern in hand, door open, asking no questions beyond where he wanted the crates stacked. Rowena watched the crew unload with the same efficient quiet they'd worked with all day, crate by crate, the roots going into the cool, dark interior of the warehouse, where the temperature was about as close to ideal as you were going to get in an unheated building in October. When the last crate was in and the doors were shut and locked, Tess handed Rowena the padlock key without ceremony. "Your cargo," Tess said. "Your key." Rowena closed her hand around it. It was a small, heavy thing, cold from the night air. She put it in her breast pocket next to where her father used to keep his notebook. Vance paid the crew in the warehouse yard, cash from a leather wallet, each person counted out without argument or delay. Tess pocketed hers and shook Rowena's hand before she left, a firm, brief grip, and said, "Good crop. Your father did the hard work first. You just had to not ruin it." It was the closest thing to a compliment Rowena had heard from her, and she understood it was meant as one. Mac was the last to leave, still coiling something unnecessarily, in the way of young people who aren't sure how to exit a situation they found meaningful. He looked at Rowena once before he walked away, a look she couldn't quite read. 17 years old, impressed by something, not sure how to say it. He didn't say it, he just left. She understood that too. The weighing happened the next morning at 8. Vance had a proper scale at his office, a commercial balance that he'd calibrated himself, and they spent 2 hours opening each crate and recording the weights in a ledger while a young man Vance employed as a clerk wrote the numbers down in a hand so neat it looked printed. Rowena watched every number go in. She'd brought her father's notebook and compared the yield estimates he'd written in the margins of the echinacea pages against what was actually on the scale. He'd estimated conservatively. Of course he had. He was a careful man. The final weight came out nearly 40% higher than his projections. She sat in the chair across from Vance's desk with that number written on a piece of paper in front of her and felt a particular kind of silence settle around her. The silence of a thing you've been trying not to believe in fully, because believing it fully seemed like a good way to get destroyed when it turned out not to be true. And then it turns out to be true, and you don't know quite what to do with yourself. "The Chicago buyer," Vance said. He'd been watching her face. "I wired him this morning. His response came back an hour ago." He slid a paper across the desk. "That's his offer per pound, for the full quantity." She read the number, read it again. "That's the price he's offering," she said. "That's his opening offer," Vance said. "I believe he'll go higher. The quality of the root is, Your father's seed stock really was something exceptional. The Shoshone Valley provenance, the specific growing conditions you had this season. This is not common echinacea. The buyer knows that. She put the paper down. What do you recommend? Counter at 15% above his opening. He'll meet us somewhere in between and we'll both feel appropriately uncomfortable about it, which is how you know the price is right. Vance allowed himself a small, dry smile. He has a buyer in Germany already lined up. European pharmaceutical demand for Western-grown medicinal root is considerable. He's not going to walk away from this. Then counter, she said. He countered. The reply came back the same afternoon. They settled at a number that was, when Rowena sat that evening in Vance's office and worked through the arithmetic on paper, enough to pay off the entirety of her father's remaining debt on the property. Enough to carry her through the winter without drawing down to nothing. Enough to re-outfit the farm properly in spring. Tools, seed stock. Juniper deserved a decent barn, and there was a crack in the cabin's east wall she'd been pretending wasn't getting worse. And enough left over to start something new. She sat with that leftover number for a long time. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't the kind of money that changed what kind of person you were or what the world expected of you. But it was real. And it was hers. And she'd grown it out of ground that everyone had told her was worthless. Goods injunction collapsed within the week. Vance's lawyer and Casper filed the response with her father's correspondence attached. And the judge, not a friendly judge to Good's position, as it turned out, because Good had overused friendly judges in this district and the remaining ones had formed opinions about his methods, dismissed the temporary restraining order on the grounds that the alleged right of first refusal had been explicitly disputed in writing by the property owner during his lifetime and could not be imposed on his heirs after the fact. Rowena heard about the dismissal from Vance in a brief letter that arrived at her property in early November. The letter was characteristically economical. 3 sentences, the relevant facts, a note that the Chicago transaction had been finalized and she should expect payment within 30 days. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then put it in the seed box with the others. The payment came in 26 days, a bank draft from a Denver institution that Vance had arranged as intermediary. She rode to Casper to cash it herself because she didn't trust a draft of that size to any local arrangement, and she stood at the bank window while the teller counted out the bills with the particular deliberateness of bank tellers everywhere, making sure you understood that the institution was in no hurry on your behalf. She put the money in an inside pocket and buttoned her coat over it and walked out into a Casper afternoon that was cold and gray and entirely ordinary. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment. People moved past her with their errands and their concerns and their own invisible weights. Nobody looked at her twice. She was a young woman in a worn coat on a November afternoon, and whatever she was carrying in her pocket was invisible to all of them, which felt, oddly, exactly right. She paid off the property debt at the Territorial Land Office before she left town. The clerk stamped the deed and handed it back to her with the particular indifference of clerks who process important documents all day and have long since stopped feeling what they represent. She rode home with the clear deed in her saddlebag, and arrived after dark and lit the stove and sat in her own kitchen on her own property and ate a bowl of beans she'd left simmering and thought about her father. Not about the money, about her father. He'd done the hard intellectual work of figuring out what this land was for. He'd spent years assembling the knowledge and the seed stock and the contacts, and then he'd run out of time before he could see it through. She'd always known that, had known it since the summer he died, and she'd first read his notebook properly. But sitting in the cabin that night with the debt paid and the deed clear and a Wyoming winter beginning outside, she understood it differently than she had before. He hadn't left her a finished thing. He'd left her a beginning. And the gap between a beginning and a finished thing was where she'd lived for the last year, in all its difficulty and cold and fear and doubt. He couldn't have crossed that gap for her. Nobody could have. That part had been hers. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she'd understood about herself in a long time. Nora stayed through December. She'd gone back to Casper after the harvest, but she came back in late November with her saddlebags and a practical question. Did Rowena have work for someone who knew logistics and wasn't afraid of a Wyoming winter? And if so, what did the pay look like? Rowena had looked at her across the kitchen table. Why? Nora shrugged. Freight work's thin in winter, and this is an interesting operation. I'm not sure what the operation is yet. Rowena said honestly. That's what makes it interesting. They settled on terms that were fair to both of them, with the understanding that the arrangement would be reconsidered in spring depending on what Rowena decided to do next. Nora moved her things into the lean-to, which Rowena had winterized better than the previous year, and began doing what she apparently did naturally, improving systems. The water hauling, the firewood storage, the way the supply runs to Harker's Crossing were organized. Rowena watched her and occasionally asked questions and occasionally told her she was wrong about something, and they argued it out, and sometimes Rowena was right and sometimes Nora was. It was the most functional working arrangement Rowena had been part of since her father was alive. In the long evenings of December, when the dark came at 4 and the stove was the center of the world, and there was nothing to do but sit and think, she worked through her father's notebook again. All of it this time. Not just the echinacea pages, but everything. The sections on valerian, on elderberry, on the specific mushrooms he'd written about in the last year of his life, what he called the shade forest cultivars, lion's mane, oyster, varieties that wanted the north-facing slopes and the decaying timber and the damp cool that the valley's hollows provided in abundance. He'd written those pages with less certainty than the echinacea pages. More questions than conclusions. The tone of a man still in the middle of learning something. She found herself finishing his sentences, not literally, but reading his questions and finding she had some of the answers from her own season, her own observation of what the land did and how it moved. He hadn't known this specific property as well as she knew it now. He'd bought it and researched it and planned for it, but she'd lived it through a full cycle of seasons, through drought and frost and crisis and harvest. She knew this ground. One evening in late December, she started writing in the back pages of the notebook, which her father had left blank. Not his careful, systematic way. She wasn't that kind of writer. Just observations. What she'd noticed about the North Slope moisture, where the shade persisted longest in summer, the section of creek draw where the timber was rotting in the right kind of way, the kind her father's notes associated with certain mushroom cultivars. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she stopped and looked at what she'd written. It wasn't a plan yet, but it was the beginning of a plan. Spring came late and mean, the way Wyoming springs often did. 2 weeks of warmth that felt like a promise. Then a hard freeze in April that killed early plantings everywhere in the valley and sent ranchers cursing out to check on their livestock. Rowena had been warned by the mountain men's winter predictions and had held off her earliest planting, which turned out to be the right call. She didn't plant echinacea that year, not in the main fields. Instead, she spent the spring doing something that looked, to anyone passing on the road, like general property improvement. She was extending the drainage work in the creek draw. She was clearing a section of the north slope. She was doing something with the decaying timber stands that involved moving logs and building what looked like rough raised beds from the road, which is exactly what they were. But the purpose wasn't obvious unless you knew what you were looking at. She'd ordered spawn from a cultivar supplier in St. Louis that Vance had connected her with over the winter. A German immigrant family who'd been growing specialty mushrooms commercially since before they'd come to America, and who Vance had written would deal fairly if she came prepared, which was the same thing he'd said about himself and which she'd found to be true. The spawn arrived in late April in carefully packed boxes, and she planted it the way her father's notes described, the basic framework supplemented now by a 4-page letter she'd received from the eldest daughter of the St. Louis family, a woman named Petra, who wrote in very good English with the occasional German word she apparently couldn't find a good translation for, and who had a gift for explaining the precise conditions that the different varieties wanted. She kept another row of echinacea going, smaller scale, in the original fields. Not 3 acres, 1 acre, which she planned to maintain as a permanent rotation, harvesting every 2 or 3 years to let the root mass rebuild. Her father's notes had suggested this. The first harvest was the establishment cost, he'd written. After that, the root comes back. She was learning to think in those longer time frames, seasons, years, the difference between mining something and farming it, the difference between taking everything and taking what grows back. Well, Clara Brennan came by in May with a different kind of expression than she'd worn on that first visit, 2 years ago now, when she'd handed over the bean soup and looked around the property with careful, reserved eyes. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and looked at Rowena with the directness that Rowena had come to understand was just Clara's way, the absence of performance that came from years of frontier life, where there wasn't much margin for pretense. "You're staying," Clara said. Again, not a question. "I'm staying." Clara looked around the cabin. It was different than it had been. Not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small improvements that came from having enough money to fix things properly. The window had real glass in it now, not oilskin. The stove had been replaced. The table was level. "Dale says you're doing something interesting on the north slope," Clara said. "Mushrooms, specialty cultivars. There's a market for them in the cities. Hotels, restaurants. It's growing." She paused. "It's slow work. Takes time to establish, but once it's going, the land does most of the labor." Clara looked at her. "Good tried to buy the Terrence place last month," she said. "North of here, past the ridge. They sold to him." "I heard. You're not worried he comes back around to bother you again?" Rowena thought about Good, about the buggy on the road, about Cutter's face at the gate, about the injunction that had lasted less than a week, about the kind of man who moved on when the opportunity closed and found the next one. "No," she said. "He's a speculator. He needed to move fast and he missed his window. There's nothing left for him to speculate on. The property's clear and the crop is gone." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Men like that aren't personally invested. They're just looking for leverage. When the leverage isn't there, they go somewhere else." Clara nodded slowly. She wasn't agreeing or disagreeing, just filing it. Then she said something that surprised Rowena. "Your father would have liked what you're doing." Rowena looked at her. "You knew him better than I thought." "I knew him a little. We talked once when he first came out here and walked the property. He asked very particular questions about the land, the specific questions. Most men who come out here ask about acreage and water rights. He asked what grew on the north slope naturally, what the soil smelled like after rain." Clara paused. "I didn't know what to make of him at the time, but I remembered it." She left an hour later, and Rowena stood at the door and watched her ride south, and thought about her father asking what the soil smelled like after rain. That was him precisely. That was the man in the notebook, the man who spent 20 years learning before he acted, the man who asked the questions nobody else thought to ask. She'd inherited that. She hadn't known she had, but she had. The mushrooms came in their first full flush in the second summer, a Wednesday morning in late August when she went to check the north slope beds and found them blooming in the way that experienced growers had told her to expect, but that she hadn't quite believed until she was standing in front of it. Lion's mane hung from the logs in white cascades that looked almost impossible, like something that belonged in a different landscape entirely. The oyster shelves spread in gray-blue tiers that caught the morning light in a way that made them look almost luminous. She stood there for a long time, just looking. Nora came up behind her and stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. "Well," Nora said finally, "that's something." "It is," Rowena said. "How long do you have before they need to come off?" "Day, maybe 2. She was already calculating. "I need to get word to Vance." "I'll ride this morning," Nora said, already turning back toward the cabin. "You stay with them." That was how it went. The first flush. Then a second 6 weeks later, smaller but still significant. And by that winter, Rowena had a working relationship with a hotel buyer in Cheyenne who took everything she could provide and asked whether she could scale up in the coming season. She told him honestly that she could, over time, and that she wouldn't promise what she couldn't deliver. And he said that was fine with him because he'd had too many suppliers promise what they couldn't deliver and then disappear. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "No," he said, looking at the samples she'd brought. "I don't suppose you are." 3 years after she'd arrived on the property with a cracked wagon wheel and a mule named Juniper, and a seed box that nobody but her father understood, Rowena Ashcroft sat on the low ridge above her land on a September afternoon and tried to see it the way a stranger would. The cabin had a proper foundation now, the sod replaced with timber framing that would last 50 years if she maintained it. The barn was real, not the lean-to from before, but an actual barn with a full roof and stalls for 3 horses, because Juniper had been joined by 2 others over the years, one purchased and one given to her by Dale Brennan in a transaction that he described as a trade for unspecified future considerations, which was Dale's way of giving something. The north slope was terraced now, with the mushroom beds, the rows of decaying logs and spawn in their cycle, the whole system quiet and alive and doing its work without her having to stand over it. The echinacea field was smaller than that first year, but permanent. 1 acre, rotating, the root coming back each time with the patient stubbornness of something that had decided it belonged here. She could see the road from the ridge. 3 years ago it had felt like a threat. The road that brought Cutter and his surveying cover story, that brought the buggy with the restraining order, that she'd watched at night from the drainage channel with her heart doing things she hadn't admitted to anyone. Now it was just a road. People passed on it. Occasionally they waved. The valley had changed its relationship with her, or she'd changed her relationship with the valley, or both. She'd stopped parsing the distinction. Dale and Clara Brennan were the closest thing she had to family now, which was both less than she'd once hoped for and more than she'd expected when she arrived. Nora had gone back to Casper the previous spring for reasons that had to do with a man who'd been writing her letters, and Rowena had been genuinely glad for her and genuinely sorry to lose her, and had not said either of those things out loud because Nora would have found it embarrassing, and so would she. She'd hired a hand for the season, a young Shoshone man named William, who knew mushroom cultivation from his grandmother, and who had turned out to know more about the North Slope's specific ecology than she'd learned in 3 years, and who was teaching her things. Her father's notebook hadn't covered because her father hadn't known them. She paid William fairly, which was more than most operations in this territory paid their hands, and William had noticed that without commenting on it, the way people notice things that deviate from expectation. The operation was not large. It was not the biggest farm in the valley, or the most profitable, or the most talked about. What it was real, persistent. It was the kind of thing that got better slowly and didn't fall apart when one season went wrong, because it wasn't dependent on one season going right. She thought about Elias Good sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. She'd heard that he'd picked up a timber claim on the other side of the territory and was in some kind of dispute with a mining company over access rights, which sounded about right. Men like Good were always in motion, always in transition between one opportunity and the next, always arriving somewhere and looking at what was there and calculating what it was worth to someone else. She didn't hate him for it. She'd stopped feeling much about him at all, which was probably the most complete way to have finished that particular chapter. What she felt when she thought about him was something more like clarity, the understanding that his way of seeing land was simply a different way than hers, not evil, not even wrong in absolute terms, just pointed at a different thing. He saw what land was worth to someone who didn't have it. She'd learned to see what land was worth to someone who lived on it and worked it and paid attention to it over time. Those were not the same number, and the gap between them was where her life had found its shape. Her father's notebook lived in the seed box, which lived on the shelf above the kitchen table. She added to the back pages regularly now, her own observations, her own questions, the things she was still learning. The notebook had more of her handwriting in it than his at this point, which had bothered her for a while and then stopped bothering her. She thought it probably would have pleased him. The whole point of a notebook like that was that it didn't end. On the ridge that September afternoon, she opened the notebook to the back pages and read what she'd written over the summer. Notes on the second-year mushroom cycle, an observation about the echinacea rotation timing, a question she hadn't answered yet about whether the southwest corner of the property, which was drier than the rest and got more direct sun, might support a different kind of cultivation entirely. Lavender, maybe, or something from her mother's seed collection that she hadn't tried yet. Her mother's seeds were still in the box. The section she'd never opened, never used, the cloth pouches and glass vials her mother had assembled in Ohio for reasons Rowena didn't entirely know. She'd been saving them, she realized, in the way you save something you're not sure how to be worthy of yet. Maybe next spring. She closed the notebook and looked out over the valley. The light was going amber in that September way, everything it touched going soft-edged and slightly unreal. Below her the farm was quiet, the horses in the barn, the mushroom beds doing their invisible work in the north slope shade, the echinacea field standing in its one careful acre, the plants drawing down into themselves for winter. She thought about this girl who'd shown up here 3 years ago with a cracked wheel and a borrowed mule, and so much fear she'd had to convert it to something else just to function. That girl had understood one thing clearly. that she had nowhere else to go and nothing else that was hers. She'd held on to the land because letting go of it would have meant letting go of the last thing connecting her to both her parents, and she wasn't willing to do that. What she hadn't understood then, couldn't have understood, because understanding it required going through it, was that the land wasn't really what she was fighting for. The land was the location. What she was fighting for was the right to be taken seriously, the right to have her choices matter, the right to make something difficult and strange and worth doing and then stand behind it even when every sensible voice was telling her to find an easier way. That was the thing nobody could give you on the frontier. The lawyers couldn't file it for you. Vance couldn't buy it for you. Dale Brennan couldn't lend it to you from across a fence. You earned it the way she'd earned it, badly, slowly, in the cold, one night at a time, with a rifle across your lap in a drainage channel, afraid and stubborn, and not quite sure you'd make it until the morning you woke up and the harvest was done and you realized you already had. She sat on the ridge until the light went, the way she'd sat in the drainage channel 3 years ago, watching the dark, waiting, paying attention. Then she went home. The cabin was warm, the stove was going. She'd left beans on before she went up to the ridge, and the smell hit her when she opened the door, plain and good, and exactly what she'd wanted. She hung her coat, put the notebook back in the seed box, sat down at the table. Outside, Wyoming was doing what it always did. Cold coming down from the mountains, stars beginning to show, the land settling into itself for another night. Inside, Rowena Ashcroft ate her supper and made notes for the morning, and the season turned and the work went on.